A Black Delta Force hero is targeted by a racist prison gang, unaware of his legendary past. Hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell to catch our latest videos. Don't miss this gripping tale of justice against prejudice. Join us for more stories that'll keep you riveted. In a cold gray prison yard, a group of men set their sights on their newest target, a quiet, unassuming black inmate whose steady rein and solitary demeanor marked him as prey to them, a man they saw as weak, broken by a system that had stripped him of his freedom and dignity, a system that had targeted him for his skin as much as his past. They sneered at him during meal breaks, their whispers laced with racial slurs. "He doesn't belong here." Another one of them thinking he's better, their hatred simmering beneath the surface, fueled by the Iron Fangs' twisted code of supremacy. To them, he was just another victim. But appearances can be deceiving. The man they planned to break was no ordinary inmate. He was once the most feared Delta Force commander in the military, leading covert missions into enemy territory that others wouldn't dare attempt. His hands carrying the weight of countless kills, each one a calculated decision made in the name of duty, framed for a crime he didn't commit. He was now a pawn in a larger game, and the gang had been hired to ensure he didn't survive long enough to uncover the truth. Their hatred for his race only sharpening their intent. Their first mistake was assuming he was an easy target. Their second was forcing him to respond. As the gang escalated their threats, the fragile balance of the prison began to shift, setting the stage for a confrontation that would ripple far beyond its walls. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a reckoning that would expose the corruption and racism running through the veins of the system, a reckoning that would remind everyone that even in the darkest places, there are men who refuse to be broken. The clang of the cell door reverberated through the block, a sharp reminder of the reality Malik Stone now faced. Inside the dimly lit space, he stood motionless, his imposing frame nearly filling the small room, his dark brown eyes sharp and calculating as they scanned his surroundings, the walls stained with years of neglect, the lingering scent of sweat and despair in the air, a far cry from the precision and discipline of his Delta Force days. He took a deep breath, his mind pulling him back to missions in the deserts of Afghanistan, where they'd called him the Shadow, a man who moved unseen, struck with precision, and left no trace, his comrades trusting him with their lives. Now, here he was, betrayed by a country he had sworn to protect, framed for a crime he didn't commit, his skin marking him as a target in a system that had long been stacked against him. A system where black men were too often seen as threats, not heroes. Malik sat on the edge of the metal cob, the thin mattress creaking beneath his weight, his fingers grazing the cold steel of the bed frame as he thought of his family, his mother's proud smile when he returned home in uniform, the folded flag from his father's military funeral still tucked away in a box he'd never had the heart to open. Those memories, his anchor in a place that sought to strip him of everything. But the weight of the current moment pressed heavily on him. Through the small reinforced window on the cell door, he could see the other inmates moving through the block, tattoos marking alliances, body language revealing intent, the lines between predator and prey clearly drawn. And Malik knew where he stood, a target. Whispers had already reached him. The Iron Fangs, the self-proclaimed rulers of the yard, had taken an interest, their hatred fueled not just by a contract, but by their own prejudice. Their sneers of "he thinks he's better than us 'cause he's black," a constant taunt. Their violence simmering just beneath the surface, a violence Malik knew was coming. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white, his voice a low mutter. "I've faced worse." But even as he reassured himself, the question gnawed at him. How long could he last in a place where his skin made him a target before his enemies struck? The door's observation panel slid open, and a guard's indifferent face appeared, his voice gruff. "Visitor," he said, and Malik rose, his mind already shifting gears. It had to be Ava. Maybe she had answers. Maybe she had hope. Or maybe this visit would only deepen the mystery surrounding the betrayal that had brought him here. A betrayal rooted in a system that had always seen him as less, as other, as a threat to be eliminated. The visitation room of the Santa Monica prison was a stark, gray box. Its scratched plexiglass divider a cold barrier between Malik Stone and Ava Bennett, the one person on the outside fighting to clear his name. Her presence a lifeline in a place that sought to drown him. Malik sat in the hard metal chair, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, his dark skin catching the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights, his dark brown eyes steady but shadowed with the weight of the prison's relentless pressure, a pressure that bore down harder on him as a black man, marked as a target by a system that had never seen him as equal. Ava leaned forward, her sharp hazel eyes studying him, her voice low but urgent through the small metal speaker. "Malik, I've been pulling every string I can find," she said, her tone a mix of determination and frustration. "The case against you is full of holes, but it's going to take time to expose them. Until then, you have to stay safe." Malik's jaw tightened, his hand resting against the cool steel table. The word safe, a bitter irony in a place where every corner held a threat, where his skin made him a target as much as his past. "You don't know what it's like in here, Ava," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, his eyes flickering with the strain of holding himself together. "Every corner I turn, every breath I take, I feel it. This isn't a battlefield where you know who the enemy is. Here, they're everywhere." Ava frowned, her pen frozen over the notepad in her lap, her expression softening as she saw the cracks in the man she'd come to admire. The unshakable Delta Force commander who'd once led missions others wouldn't dare touch. "The Iron Fangs, they're watching me," Malik admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "Sizing me up, calling me saying I don't belong. It's only a matter of time before they make their move." His gaze faltered for a moment, his composure slipping, the sting of their slurs. Another black thug thinking he's tough, cutting deeper than he'd admit. A reminder of the racism he'd faced even before prison, in a world that had always judged him before he could speak. Ava's expression softened, her usual sharp edge giving way to genuine concern. "Malik, you've faced worse than these thugs," she said, her voice firm but warm. "You've led missions no one else would even dream of taking. You're one of the strongest men I've ever met." Malik's voice wavered, his fists clenching, the weight of his isolation pressing down. "Out there, I had a team. I had control," he said, his tone raw. "In here, I'm alone. I've seen men break in this place, strong men. Ava, and I don't know if I'm ready for it." Ava's hand hovered over the glass, an unspoken gesture of support, her voice steady but urgent. "You won't break. I know you won't," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "But you have to promise me something. If they come for you, you fight. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you afraid." Malik's eyes met hers, the fear giving way to a flicker of resolve, a spark of the man who'd earned the name the Shadow in the deserts of Afghanistan, a man who'd never backed down, even when the odds were against him. "I'm trying, Ava," he said, his voice low but firm. "But this place, it's a different kind of war. There's no honor here, no rules." Ava nodded, her gaze steely. "I know it's not fair," she said, her tone softening. "I know this isn't where you're supposed to be, but you have to hold on. The truth is out there, and I'll find it. You didn't sabotage that pipeline, Malik, and we're going to prove it." Malik exhaled sharply, the weight of her words both comforting and suffocating. The truth a distant hope in a place that thrived on lies, a place where his skin made him a target as much as the frame job that had landed him here. "They framed me for a reason," he said, his voice steadying, his mind sharpening. "Someone powerful wanted me out of the picture, and they're not going to stop. The Iron Fangs, they're just the start." Ava leaned back, her voice dropping to a near whisper. her eyes scanning the room for any sign of prying ears. "I'm already digging," she said, her tone urgent. "The evidence they used against you, it doesn't add up. I've found discrepancies in the witness statements, missing files, and the warden." She paused, her voice dropping even lower. "He's not clean. There's money moving through his accounts that shouldn't be there." Malik raised an eyebrow, his mind racing. "You think the warden's involved?" he said, his tone sharp. "I'm not sure yet," Ava replied, her voice cautious. "But someone in this prison is keeping an eye on you, and not just the gang. If I can find the connection, I can blow this wide open. But you need to give me time." The door behind Malik creaked open, and the guard stepped inside, his voice gruff. "Time's up," he said, his tone indifferent, his eyes flickering with a subtle disdain that Malik had come to recognize, a look that said, "You don't belong here." The same look he'd seen from the Iron Fangs, the same look he'd seen his whole life as a black man in a world that too often refused to see his worth. Ava's voice softened, her eyes locking onto his one last time. "Malik, listen to me. You're not alone in this," she said, her tone urgent. "I'm with you every step of the way. Stay strong, fight back if you have to, but don't lose yourself in here." Malik stood, towering over the table, his expression hardening as he prepared to leave, her words echoing in his mind. Strength, fight, survive. But even as he tried to hold on to them, the truth gnawed at him. This place was wearing him down, piece by piece, and the Iron Fangs were circling, their hatred fueled by racism as much as their contract, waiting for the moment he'd slip. The mess hall was alive with the chaotic noise of clattering trays, muffled conversations, and occasional bursts of laughter that didn't reach Malik, who sat alone at one of the worn metal tables, his back instinctively to the wall, his sharp eyes scanning the room, his senses on high alert. Not paranoia, but survival in a place where his skin made him a target. The Iron Fangs were there, scattered across several tables, their presence dominating the room like a pack of wolves staking their claim. Their tattoos, a mix of snarling beasts and crude symbols, marking them as predators. Their sneers and whispers, a constant reminder of their intent. He doesn't belong here. Let's teach him a lesson. Malik focused on his tray in front of him, overcooked pasta, something resembling bread, and watery beans, eating slowly, forcing each bite down as his instincts screamed at him to stay alert. Every movement, every sound cataloged in his mind, the weight of their hatred pressing down like a storm waiting to break. "Hey, Stone!" A sharp voice cut through the din, and the room seemed to quiet slightly, the air thickening with tension. Malik did not look up immediately, knowing better than to give them the satisfaction. But when the voice came again, closer this time, he raised his head. Drake Voss, the leader of the Iron Fangs, stood a few feet away, his gang flanking him like hyenas circling prey. A smug grin plastered across his face as he scanned Malik with disdain. "What's the matter, soldier boy?" Drake sneered, loud enough for others to hear, his tone dripping with malice. "Food not up to your standards? Or you too good for us now? Huh? 'Cause you're black?" Malik met his gaze, his expression calm but unyielding, the slur a sting he'd felt too many times, a reminder of the racism that had followed him from the streets to the battlefield to this hellhole. "Just trying to get through my meal in peace," he said, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving Drake's, a quiet defiance that spoke louder than words. Drake laughed, a sound more threatening than humorous, leaning forward to rest his hands on the table as his gang closed in behind him, their presence a wall of menace. "Peace," he said, his tone mocking, his eyes glinting with hatred. "You think there's peace in here? You're in the jungle now, Stone. And in the jungle, the weak get eaten alive, especially ones like you." The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick enough to choke on, the other inmates watching, waiting for Malik to break. their silence a testament to the Iron Fangs' reign of terror, a reign built on fear and prejudice, a reign Malik knew he couldn't escape without a fight. Drake's smirk faltered for a split second before returning, sharper this time, as he straightened, motioning to one of his men, a wiry guy with a crooked nose, who stepped forward, snatching the bread off Malik's tray and taking a dramatic bite. "Ain't bad, huh?" the man said, the gang laughing, the sound echoing through the hall like a taunt, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of humiliation, their hatred for Malik's skin fueling their cruelty. Malik's jaw tightened, but he didn't move, his gaze locked on Drake, refusing to give them the reaction they craved, the reaction they expected from a black man they saw as less as prey. Drake tilted his head, his voice dropping to something more venomous, his words a dagger aimed at Malik's core. "You know what I see when I look at you," he said, his tone dripping with disdain, his eyes burning with prejudice. "A man who doesn't belong here, a man who thinks he's better than the rest of us. But you're not better, Stone. You're just another black thug they tossed in here to rot." The words hit harder than Malik expected, stirring the lingering doubts and fears he'd been trying to suppress. The racism a raw wound, a reminder of every time he'd been judged, dismissed, targeted for his skin, from the battlefield where white officers had questioned his leadership to the streets where he'd been profiled, stopped, harassed. For a moment, he felt the room closing in, the eyes of everyone watching, waiting for him to break. But Malik forced himself to stay steady, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside. "You've got it wrong," he said, his tone unyielding, his eyes burning with a fire that had carried him through missions others wouldn't dare touch. "I'm not here to rot, and I'm not afraid of you." Drake's smirk widened, but there was something darker in his eyes now, something dangerous, a predator sensing a challenge, his hatred for Malik's defiance, for his very existence as a black man, fueling his next words. "Oh, you will be," he said, his voice a low growl, a promise of violence. "Give it time." The gang laughed again, their voices grating like nails on a chalkboard. Drake taking a step back, his gaze never leaving Malik, his smirk a promise of more to come. "Enjoy your meal, soldier boy," he said, his tone dripping with malice. "While you can." They moved away, their laughter and jeers lingering in the air, a taunt that echoed through the hall, a reminder of the storm that was coming, a storm fueled by racism as much as their contract, a storm Malik knew he couldn't avoid. He exhaled slowly, his grip on the tray loosening, the eyes of the other inmates on him, some curious, others pitying, a few amused, but Malik didn't care about their opinions, only survival. A survival made harder by the color of his skin, by a system that had always seen him as less, as a threat to be eliminated. He forced himself to finish his meal, each bite a deliberate act of defiance, a refusal to let them see fear, even as it crept up his spine, a fear born not just of the Iron Fangs' threats, but of a world that had never given him a fair fight, a world he'd have to face head-on if he was going to make it out of this alive. The mess hall's tension lingered like a storm cloud as Malik Stone walked back to his cell, the dim fluorescent lights of the Santa Monica prison flickering overhead, casting jagged shadows across the cracked concrete floors, the air heavy with the scent of stale food and sweat, a constant reminder of the hostile environment that sought to break him, not just as a man, but as a black man, his skin a target in a place where prejudice thrived as much as violence. The usual noise of inmates shouting or laughing from their cells was muted, replaced by a quiet anticipation that set Malik's nerves on edge, his dark brown eyes scanning the corridor, his imposing frame moving with purpose, every step deliberate, his senses tuned to every sound, every movement, a survival instinct honed through years as a Delta Force commander. An instinct that had kept him alive in war zones but now faced a different kind of battlefield, one where his very existence as a black man made him a target. The echoes of Drake Voss's words, "You're just another black thug they tossed in here to rot," still rang in his ears. The racial slur, a dagger pin that cut deeper than the physical threats. A reminder of the systemic racism that had followed him from the streets to the battlefield, to this hellhole. A racism that fueled the Iron Fangs' hatred as much as their contract to kill him. Their sneers of "he doesn't belong here," a constant taunt, a declaration that his skin made him less, made him prey. Malik's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides, his mind replaying the mess hall encounter. Drake's smug grin, the gang's laughter, the way they would use his race to belittle him, to justify their violence. A violence he knew was coming, a violence he'd have to face alone in a place where the guards turned a blind eye. Their own prejudice aligning with the Iron Fangs' agenda, a system that had always seen black men like him as threats, not heroes. The ambush came fast. A sharp sound, the muffled thud of boots on the concrete floor, his only warning before a wiry figure lunged at him from the shadows. The glint of a sharpened toothbrush catching the dim light, aimed straight for his side. Malik pivoted instinctively, deflecting the attack with a forearm, the impact jarring his arm, but his training taking over. Every movement precise and efficient, a testament to the Delta Force commander he'd once been. The man who'd earned the name the Shadow in the deserts of Afghanistan. The first assailant, a lanky man with tattoos snaking up his neck. His eyes burning with hatred, staggered back, snarling. Get him. He's just a black dog. The slur, a venomous taunt that fueled his next attack. But two more rushed in. One going low to tackle Malik, while the other swung a makeshift shiv aimed at his ribs. Malik twisted, the blade grazing his side, drawing a thin line of blood, the sting sharp but familiar. A pain he'd endured in countless missions, a pain he pushed through as he delivered a brutal elbow to the second man's face, sending him crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. The man's racist jeer, "You don't belong here." Cut off by the impact, the third assailant managed to grab him from behind, locking thick arms around his chest, his breath hot against Malik's ear as he hissed, "Time to put you in your place, boy." The word a slap, a reminder of every time Malik had been belittled, dismissed, targeted for his skin, from the streets where he had been profiled to the battlefield where white officers had questioned his leadership, a prejudice that had followed him here, into this hellhole where his very existence was a challenge to their twisted supremacy. Malik shifted his weight, slamming the man backward into the nearest cell bars, the clang echoing through the block like a metallic scream, drawing the attention of onlookers, inmates peering through their bars, their eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and unease, their silence a testament to the Iron Fangs' reign of terror, a reign built on fear and racism, a reign Malik was determined to defy. "Come on, soldier boy," a voice snarled, and Drake Voss stepped into view, his smirk replaced with a cruel grin, his eyes glinting with malice as he watched his men swarm Malik, his presence a dark shadow at the edge of the fray, a predator toying with his prey. "Let's see if all that military training can save you now, you black piece of trash." And the slur hit like a punch, the racism unmasked, a declaration of intent as much as the attack itself, a reminder that to Drake, Malik's skin was as much a reason to hate him as the contract that had brought them together, a contract to kill him before he could uncover the truth. Malik's fists flew, every strike calculated, every movement designed to conserve energy, a solid punch to one attacker's jaw sending him sprawling. But another came at him with a shiv, slicing dangerously close to his arm, the blade nicking him, drawing another thin line of blood, the pain a sharp reminder of the odds against him, the hatred fueling their assault as much as their orders. "You think you're untouchable," Drake taunted, standing back while his men did the dirty work, his voice dripping with venom, his eyes burning with prejudice. "You're nothing in here, just another dog waiting to be put down. because that's all your kind deserves. The words were a dagger, the racism a raw wound, a reminder of every time Malik had been judged, dismissed, targeted for his skin, a hatred that had followed him from the streets to the battlefield to this hellhole, a hatred he refused to let break him. Malik didn't answer. Words wouldn't matter to men like this, men who saw his skin as a reason to hate, as a justification for violence. Instead, he grabbed a chair left outside one of the cells and swung it with force, battering the men like bowling pins. The sound of the impact reverberating through the block, silencing the onlookers for a moment, their eyes wide with shock at the defiance of a black man who refused to bow, who refused to break. It seemed over. The attackers lying groaning on the floor, their bravado shattered, their racist taunts silenced by the reality of Malik's strength. But Drake stepped forward, slow and deliberate, cracking his knuckles, his eyes burning with hatred, his voice a low growl. "You think that's it?" he sneered, his tone dripping with malice, his gaze a promise of more to come. "This ain't over. Stone, not by a long shot. We'll show you where you belong." Before Malik could respond, the sharp whistle of a guard's baton cut through the air, a harsh command breaking the tension. "Break it up!" A guard stormed into the scene, his baton raised as he glared at the group. But Malik didn't miss the brief glance the guard exchanged with Drake, a flicker of something unspoken, a hint of complicity that spoke to the corruption running through the prison, a corruption that targeted black men like him as much as the Iron Fangs did. "You!" The guard barked at Malik, pointing the baton at him, his tone laced with the same disdain Malik had heard too many times, a disdain that saw his skin before his humanity. "Back to your cell, now." Malik wiped the blood from his arm with the back of his hand, his breathing heavy but controlled, his gaze steady as he turned his back on Drake. The gang leader's smirk, a promise of more violence, more hatred, a promise Malik knew he'd have to face again, a promise rooted in racism as much as in greed, a promise he'd defy with every ounce of his strength, a strength that had carried him through war zones, a strength that would carry him through this hellhole, no matter the pain. The echo of running water filled the shower room of the Santa Monica prison, steam rising in thin ghostly wisps from the tiled floor, the air heavy with the scent of damp concrete and rust, a stark contrast to the cold, gray corridors Malik Stone had just left behind, his dark skin glistening under the lukewarm stream, his braided hair clinging to his scalp, his dark brown eyes scanning the space, the room's eerie stillness setting his nerves on edge. The usual chatter of inmates, the shuffle of feet, the idle banter that filled even the most mundane moments of prison life, it was all absent, replaced by a tense quiet that screamed danger. A quiet Malik knew too well. A quiet that meant the Iron Fangs were coming. Their hatred for him as a black man fueling their violence as much as their contract to kill him. He turned slightly, water dripping from his face, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But before he could act, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the entrance. A deliberate, menacing rhythm that cut through the steam like a blade. Malik turned sharply, his gaze narrowing as he saw them, Drake Voss and the Iron Fangs. 6 of them, their silhouettes cutting through the haze like specters, their presence a dark promise of violence, their eyes burning with a hatred that went beyond their orders, a hatred rooted in the color of Malik's skin, a hatred that had followed him his whole life, from the streets where he'd been profiled to the battlefield where he'd been underestimated, to this hellhole where he was seen as less, as prey, as a target to be broken. Drake stood at the front, his smirk wide and cruel, his hands casually in his pockets as if this were just another day in the yard, his voice echoing ominously in the confined space. "Stone," he drawled, dragging out the name like a taunt, his eyes glinting with malice. "Guess you didn't get the memo. Shower time's been rescheduled just for you, boy." The slur hit like a slap, a reminder of the racism that fueled Drake's hatred, A hatred that saw Malik's skin as a justification for violence. A hatred that had been there in every sneer, every taunt, every whisper of "he doesn't belong here," that had followed him since he'd arrived. Malik stepped back slowly, his bare feet gripping the wet tiles, his mind racing, his body coiled like a spring, ready to move, ready to fight. A warrior's instinct honed through years as a Delta Force commander. An instinct that had kept him alive in war zones but now faced a different kind of enemy, one driven by prejudice as much as greed. Drake tilted his head, feigning disappointment, his voice dripping with venom. "What's the matter? Soldier boy, you're not running already, are you?" he said, his tone mocking, his eyes burning with hatred as he stepped forward. Malik's eyes darted toward the entrance, where two of Drake's men moved to block the only exit, their broad frames filling the doorway, their sneers a mirror to their leaders, their voices low and menacing. "You're not going anywhere. Black trash," one of them growled, the slur a dagger, a declaration of intent as much as the weapons in their hands. Drake's smirk widened, his voice a low growl as he stepped closer, his words a promise of violence. "We told you this was coming, didn't we?" he said. It did, he said, his tone dripping with malice. "Tonight's the night. Stone, let's see how tough you really are. 'Cause to me, you're just another one of them who needs to be put down." The first man lunged, a wiry figure with a scar running down his cheek, his shiv gleaming in the dim light as he aimed for Malik's chest, his voice a snarl of hatred. "This is for thinking you're better than us," he spat. The racism unmasked, a declaration that Malik's skin was as much a reason for this attack as the contract that had brought them here. Malik reacted instinctively, sidestepping the attack and driving an elbow into the man's ribs, the attacker grunting as he stumbled back. But before Malik could follow up, another came at him from the side, a punch catching him in the jaw, sending him reeling, his vision blurring for a moment as he staggered, barely keeping his footing, the room closing in around him. "Not so tough now, huh?" one of the gang members sneered, his voice cutting through the steam, his tone laced with prejudice as he delivered another blow, aiming for Malik's side, the pain sharp and searing, a reminder of the odds against him, the hatred fueling their assault as much as their orders. Malik shook off the hit, his vision clearing just in time to see the next attacker, a stocky man with tattoos covering his neck, charging at him, his voice a growl of hatred. "You don't belong here, boy," he spat, the slur a venomous taunt as he swung a makeshift blade, aiming for Malik's stomach. Malik ducked low, driving his shoulder into the man's midsection and slamming him into the wall, the impact sending a sickening thud through the room. But he didn't have time to celebrate. Another pair of hands grabbed him from behind, yanking him backward, the man's breath hot against his ear as he hissed, "Time to teach you your place," Malik growled, pulling the shiv he'd hidden beneath the waistband of his prison pants, the sharp edge gleaming briefly in the dim light as he slashed at the arms holding him, the man yelping as he let go, blood trickling down his forearm. Malik spun around, his breathing heavy, his body coiled and ready. But the gang didn't falter. They moved as one, circling him, their movements deliberate and practiced, their hatred for his skin as much a weapon as the blades in their hands, their taunts a chorus of racism that echoed through the room. "You're nothing here, just another black doing." This wasn't a random ambush. They'd planned this. Their prejudice is sharpening their intent. Their orders from Vincent Kane a justification for the violence they'd always wanted to inflict. The next attack came from his left, Malik swinging the shiv, the plastic edge slicing through the steam, but the attacker dodged, landing a punch to Malik's rib, pain shooting through him as he gasped, his muscles burning, his vision narrowing, the weight of their numbers pressing him into a corner, their hatred a relentless tide that sought to drown him. Drake finally stepped forward, cracking his knuckles, his voice a low growl of malice as he entered the fray. "Let me show you how it's done, boys," he said, his tone dripping with venom, his eyes burning with prejudice as he lunged, his punch coming fast and hard, catching Malik in the side of the head. The world spinning for a moment, and Malik fell to his knees, the taste of blood filling his mouth, his breaths coming in ragged gasps as the gang closed in, their laughter echoing around him, a cruel symphony of hatred. "Looks like the great Malik Stone isn't so great after all," Drake taunted, grabbing a handful of Malik's hair and pulling his head back, his voice a snarl of racism. "Any last words? Boy, before we put you where you belong?" Malik's grip tightened on the shiv, his body aching, his vision blurred. But he wasn't done yet. With a surge of strength, he swung upward, the blade slicing across Drake's forearm, Drake howling as he stumbled back, clutching his arm. The shock of seeing their leader injured breaking the gang's momentum for a moment, their racist taunts silenced by the reality of Malik's defiance. A black man who refused to break, who refused to bow. Malik used the opening to scramble to his feet, his chest heaving as he faced them, his odds slim, but his resolve unshaken, his voice a low growl of defiance. "I'm still standing," he said, his tone steady despite the pain, his eyes burning with a fire that had carried him through war zones, a fire that burned brighter in the face of their hatred, a fire that refused to be extinguished by their racism. "Finish him!" Drake roared, his voice filled with rage. The gang surging forward again, their blades gleaming, their hatred a palpable force. But before they could close the distance, a thunderclap broke the chaos, the sound of a baton striking metal, a voice roaring with authority. "Back off!" The gang froze, their heads snapping toward the entrance, where Ethan Brooks stood, baton in hand, fury in his eyes. His presence a storm of command, a guard who'd once served under Malik in Delta Force, a man who'd seen Malik's strength, who'd fought beside him in Kandahar, who refused to let him fall now. "What the hell's going on in here?" Ethan bellowed, stepping into the room with authority, his baton raised, his gaze locking onto Drake, who glared back, his smirk faltering but his bravado holding, his voice a snarl of defiance. "This doesn't concern you. Brooks, walk away," he said, his tone laced with the same prejudice that had fueled the attack. A prejudice that saw Malik as less, as a target to be broken. A prejudice Ethan refused to entertain. Ethan's baton struck the tiles with a loud crack, the sound reverberating through the room, his voice a low growl of authority. "I said back off, or do you want me to call in every guard on this block and have you all dragged out of here in cuffs?" The gang exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence wavering, Drake's jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists as he stared Ethan down, his pride warring with his sense of self-preservation, his hatred for Malik burning in his eyes, a hatred that wouldn't be quenched so easily. "You think you can protect him?" Drake said, his voice a low growl, his gaze shifting to Malik, a promise of more to come. "This ain't over." After a tense moment, he motioned to his crew, his voice a snarl of frustration. "Let's go." The gang retreated, their footsteps echoing as they disappeared into the corridor, Drake lingering for a second longer, his glare fixed on Malik, his smirk a promise of more violence, more hatred, a promise rooted in racism as much as in greed, a promise Malik knew he'd have to face again. Ethan waited until the last of them was gone before rushing to Malik's side, his voice tight with anger as he crouched down, helping him sit up. "Jesus, Malik," he muttered, his grip steady as he took in the cuts and bruises on Malik's body, the blood trickling down his arm, the toll of a fight driven by hatred as much as by orders. "They really did a number on you." Malik coughed, tasting blood, but managed a faint smirk, his voice hoarse but steady. "I've had worse," he said, his gaze meeting Ethan's, the weight of his situation reflected in his eyes, the weight of a system that had always seen him as less, as a threat to be eliminated, a system he'd have to fight to survive, a system he'd have to fight to change. The shower room's damp air still clung to Malik Stone as he sat on the edge of his cot in his dimly lit cell. The Santa Monica prison's cold concrete walls pressing in around him, the faint ache in his ribs, and the sting of cuts on his arm, a constant reminder of the brutal attack he'd just survived. The Iron Fangs' racist taunts, "You're just another black dog," echoing in his mind like a haunting refrain. Their hatred for his skin as much a weapon as the shivs they'd wielded against him. His dark brown eyes stared at the concrete floor, his braided hair still damp, his dark skin glistening with a mix of sweat and water. His breathing steady but heavy, the adrenaline from the fight slowly ebbing, replaced by a burning resolve, a fire that had carried him through war zones as a Delta Force commander, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the prejudice and violence of this hellhole, a fire that had been stoked by every slur, every sneer, every moment he'd been judged, dismissed, targeted for his race. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound in the cell. But Malik's mind was far from quiet, replaying every moment of the ambush, Drake Voss's cruel grin, the gang's relentless assault, the way they'd called him boy, the way they'd seen his skin as a justification for their violence, a violence fueled by racism as much as by the contract to kill him. A contract he knew was tied to a larger conspiracy, a conspiracy he'd have to uncover if he was going to survive. If he was going to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. Ethan Brooks' intervention had saved him, a reminder of the bond they'd forged in Kandahar, a bond that had given Malik a glimmer of hope in a place that thrived on despair. But he knew Ethan couldn't be everywhere, couldn't protect him from the Iron Fangs' relentless hatred, a hatred that saw him as less, as a target to be broken, a hatred that had followed him his whole life, from the streets where he'd been profiled to the battlefield where he'd been underestimated, to this prison where his very existence was a challenge to their twisted supremacy. Malik exhaled slowly, his hands running over his face, rough with stubble, his mind shifting gears, his training kicking in. Survival in a place like this wasn't about waiting for the next attack. It was about taking control, about anticipating the enemy's moves and staying one step ahead. A lesson he'd learned in the deserts of Afghanistan. A lesson he'd have to apply now if he was going to make it out of this alive. He couldn't just play defense anymore. Couldn't let the Iron Fangs dictate the terms of this fight. Couldn't let their racism and their violence break him. He had to take the fight to them. Had to show them that he wasn't just a black man they could target. That he was a warrior, a survivor, a force they couldn't destroy. The next day, during the brief free time in the yard, Malik moved with purpose. The cracked concrete beneath his feet, a stark contrast to the open skies above. The warmth of the sun on his skin, a faint reminder of life outside these walls. But the weight of the stairs around him brought him back to reality. The Iron Fangs' presence, a constant threat. Their racist whispers, "He doesn't belong here," a constant reminder of the hatred that fueled their violence. A hatred that had targeted him as much for his skin as for the contract that had brought them together. He kept his distance from Drake and his crew, who stayed in their usual spot. Drake's presence unmistakable as he laughed with his gang, clearly enjoying the attention his dominance brought. His eyes occasionally flicking to Malik, a promise of more to come. A promise rooted in racism as much as in greed. Malik's attention settled on a group near the far fence, the Strikers, a smaller band of mostly black and Latino men who kept to themselves but were known to hold their own when pushed. Their leader, Carlos Vega, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his arms and a reputation for pragmatism. A man who might be willing to listen, to help, if the price was right. Malik approached slowly, his every movement deliberate to avoid drawing unwanted attention, his dark eyes scanning the group, his imposing frame a quiet testament to the strength he carried, a strength that had been tested time and again, a strength that refused to bow to the hatred that sought to break him. As he neared, a couple of strikers stiffened, their hands twitching toward their makeshift weapons. their eyes narrowing with suspicion. But Malik raised his hand slightly, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to start anything," he said, his tone steady, his gaze locking onto Carlos, who glanced up from where he sat on a makeshift bench, his dark eyes studying Malik for a moment before he spoke, his voice low and measured. "Then why are you here?" "Stone," Carlos said, his tone cautious, his gaze flicking to the Iron Fangs in the distance. Their presence, a constant threat. Their hatred for Malik, a palpable force that hung over the yard like a storm cloud. Malik stopped a few feet away, keeping his posture neutral but strong, his voice low but steady, his words a calculated risk in a place where trust was as rare as freedom. "I need help, and I'm willing to pay for it," he said, his tone unwavering, his eyes burning with a fire that had carried him through war zones, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the racism and violence of this hellhole. Carlos smirked, leaning back, his arms crossing over his chest, his voice a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Help from us? You know how this works. Stone, if you're asking for help, you're bringing your problems to my doorstep." "Why would I want that?" Malik's gaze didn't waver, his voice steady, his words a challenge as much as a plea born of necessity, but backed by the strength of a man who'd never backed down, who'd never let hatred define him. "Because I know you don't like the Iron Fangs," he said, his tone sharp, his eyes flicking to Drake and his crew in the distance, their sneers a constant reminder of their hatred, their racism a constant threat. "You and I both know they think they run this place, especially over us. Because of our skin, I can give you an opening to hit back." The men around Carlos exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves, their voices low but tense, the weight of Malik's words sinking in, the shared experience of racism, a bond that transcended their differences, a bond that had been forged in the crucible of a system that had always seen them as threats to be eliminated. Carlos raised a hand, silencing them, his gaze locking onto Malik's, his voice low but firm. "You want us to go to war with Drake and his crew? You think we're stupid?" Malik shook his head, his voice steady, his resolve unshaken. "Not war, just a statement," he said, his tone a quiet storm. "They've been coming after me, calling me boy, saying I don't belong because I'm black. I know they're not going to stop, but they're not untouchable. I just need a little backup to take a few of them out of play. Send a message." Carlos tilted his head, considering, his eyes narrowing as he studied Malik, the weight of their shared experience hanging between them. The racism they'd both faced, a silent bond, a bond that had been forged in the crucible of a system that had always targeted them, that had always sought to break them. "And what do we get out of this?" Carlos said, his voice low, his gaze sharp, his tone a challenge as much as a question. "I'll owe you," Malik replied, his voice steady, his eyes burning with determination. A determination that had carried him through war zones, a determination that refused to bow to the hatred that sought to break him. "You give me protection, and I'll make it worth your while. Commissary trades, intel, whatever you need." Carlos's smirk returned, but there was a hint of respect in his gaze now, a recognition of the strength Malik carried, a strength that had been tested by racism as much as by violence, a strength that refused to break, even in the face of overwhelming odds. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," Carlos said, his voice low but firm. "But guts don't always pay off in here." Malik's gaze didn't waver, his voice a quiet storm, his words a testament to the warrior he'd always been, a warrior who'd never backed down, who'd never let hatred define him. "They do when they're backed by results," he countered, his tone unwavering. "I've taken hits before, but I'm still standing. If you help me take a few of them down, it'll show everyone in this yard that the Iron Fangs aren't invincible, that their racist bullshit doesn't run this place. That's worth more than in commissary." Carlos leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze locking onto Malik's, the yard buzzing around them. But in that moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them, two men bound by the shared experience of racism, by the shared fight for survival in a system that had always sought to break them. "Okay," Carlos said finally, his voice low but firm. A decision made, a pact forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. "You've got yourself a deal, but if this goes sideways, you're on your own. Got it?" Malik nodded, his tone unwavering, his resolve a fire that burned brighter in the face of their shared fight. "Got it," he said, his voice steady, his eyes burning with a determination that had carried him through war zones, a determination that refused to bow to the hatred that sought to break him. That night, the plan went into motion. Carlos had tipped him off to a weak link in the Iron Fangs, a younger member named Nate Riley, who often broke off from the group after lights out to sneak contraband through the cell blocks. His arrogance, a weakness Malik could exploit, a weakness that could send a message to Drake and his crew, a message that their racism wouldn't go unanswered, that their violence wouldn't break him. Malik waited in the shadows near the corridor, his shiv hidden in the sleeve of his shirt, the faint hum of the overhead lights the only sound as he watched Nate's wiry frame approach, his steps light and casual, his guard down, his arrogance a product of the Iron Fangs' reign of terror, a reign built on fear and prejudice, a reign Malik was determined to challenge. Malik stepped out, blocking his path, his voice cold and sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Nate Riley," he said, his tone a low growl, his gaze locking onto the younger man's, his presence a quiet storm that filled the corridor with tension. Nate froze, his eyes widening, his hand darting to his waistband. But Malik was faster. He lunged forward, slamming Nate against the wall and pressing the shiv to his neck, his voice a deadly whisper. "You tell Drake this stops now." Malik growled, his eyes burning with a fire that had carried him through war zones, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the racism and violence of this hellhole. "He comes at me again, and I'll make sure he's next. You got that?" Nate swallowed hard, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his face pale, his confidence shattered, his voice trembling as he nodded. "You're dead, Stone. You don't scare us," he said, but his voice shook, the bravado hollow in the face of Malik's strength, a strength that defied their hatred, that defied their racism, that defied their attempts to break him. Malik pressed the shiv harder, his voice a low growl, his words a promise as much as a threat. "You sure about that?" he said, his tone steady, his gaze unyielding. "Because I've got nothing to lose, and I promise you, I'll take as many of you with me as I can. Now go." He stepped back, letting Nate stumble away, his face pale, his confidence shattered, his footsteps echoing down the corridor as he fled. A message delivered, a message that would reach Drake, a message that their racism wouldn't go unanswered, that their violence wouldn't break him. From the shadows, Carlos emerged, nodding approvingly, his voice low but firm, a recognition of the strength Malik carried, a strength that had been tested by racism as much as by violence, a strength that refused to break, even in the face of overwhelming odds. "Not bad, Stone," Carlos said, his tone a mix of respect and caution. "Not bad at all." Malik didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the empty corridor ahead, his mind racing, his resolve a fire that burned brighter with every step, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that sought to break him, a fire that would carry him through the fight to come, a fight for survival, a fight for justice, a fight for the truth that would set him free. So, the dim, damp hallway near the laundry room of the Santa Monica prison was a labyrinth of shadows, the faint hum of washing machines a low drone in the background, the air heavy with the scent of detergent and mildew, a stark contrast to the cold, gray corridors Malik Stone had navigated moments before, his dark skin glistening with sweat, his dark brown eyes sharp and focused, his braided hair pulled tight, his body coiled with the tension of a warrior ready for battle. A battle he'd been preparing for since the moment he'd decided to take the fight to the Iron Fangs. A battle that would test his resolve, his strength, his defiance in the face of their racist hatred. Malik stood with his back pressed against the cold concrete wall, his shiv hidden in the sleeve of his prison shirt, his breathing steady, but his senses on high alert, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a storm waiting to break. The echoes of Drake Voss's slurs, "You're just another black dog," still ringing in his ears, a reminder of the racism that fueled the gang's violence as much as their contract to kill him, a racism that had followed him his whole life, from the streets where he'd been profiled to the battlefield where he'd been underestimated, to this hellhole where his very existence was a challenge to their twisted supremacy. He wasn't alone. Carlos Vega and 3 other strikers flanked him, their expressions grim and determined, their makeshift weapons clutched tightly, their presence a testament to the pact they'd forged, a pact born of shared struggle, of shared defiance against a system that had always targeted them, that had always seen them as less, as threats to be eliminated. Carlos murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes scanning the corridor ahead. "They're bringing everyone. You sure you want to do this here? Guards aren't going to step in if things get ugly." Malik's jaw tightened, his gaze steady, his resolve a fire that burned brighter in the face of their shared fight, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that sought to break him. "I don't have a choice," he said, his tone low but firm, his voice a quiet storm. "If we don't stop them now, they'll keep coming. They'll take me apart piece by piece until there's nothing left. All because of my skin." Carlos nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line, his voice low but resolute, a recognition of the racism they'd both faced, a racism that had forged a bond between them, a bond that would carry them through the fight to come. "All right," he said, his tone a mix of caution and determination. "But if we're doing this, we do it right." The plan was simple but dangerous. Nate Riley's fear had sent a message to the Iron Fangs, a message that their racism wouldn't go unanswered, that their violence wouldn't break Malik, and now they'd come for him, their numbers bolstered, their hatred sharpened by the humiliation of one of their own, a hatred that saw Malik's skin as a justification for their violence, a hatred that had been there in every sneer, every taunt, every whisper of "he doesn't belong here" that had followed him since he'd arrived. The sound of heavy boots echoed down the corridor, a deliberate rhythm that cut through the silence like a drumbeat of war, and Malik's eyes narrowed as he saw them, Drake Voss and the Iron Fangs. 8 of them, their silhouettes filling the narrow hallway, their eyes burning with malice, their makeshift weapons gleaming in the dim light, their voices low and menacing as they approached, their hatred for Malik's skin as much a weapon as the blades in their hands. Drake stopped a few feet away, his smirk wide and cruel, his gaze locking onto Malik, his voice a snarl of racism as much as of violence. "Thought you could scare us off." "Stone," he said, his tone dripping with venom, his eyes burning with prejudice. "You think sending Nate running changes anything? You're still just a black piece of trash who doesn't belong here, and tonight, we're gonna make sure you know your place." Sorry, the slur hit like a slap, a reminder of the racism that fueled Drake's hatred, a hatred that had been there in every attack, every taunt, a hatred that saw Malik's skin as a justification for their violence, a hatred that had followed him his whole life, a hatred he refused to let break him. Malik stepped forward, his shiv slipping into his hand, his voice a low growl of defiance, his eyes burning with a fire that had carried him through war zones, a fire that refused to be extinguished by their prejudice. "You talk a big game, Drake," he said, his tone steady, his gaze unyielding. "But I'm still standing, and I'm not going anywhere." Drake's smirk faltered for a split second, but it returned sharper, his voice a snarl of hatred as he motioned to his crew, his words a declaration of intent as much as a command. Take him down. Boys, show this black dog what happens when he steps out of line. The Iron Fangs surged forward, their blades gleaming, their voices a chorus of racism that echoed through the corridor. He doesn't belong here. Put him in his place. Their hatred a palpable force. A force Malik met with the full weight of his training, his shiv flashing as he struck, his movements precise and efficient. A testament to the Delta Force commander he'd once been, a commander who'd earned the name the Shadow in the deserts of Afghanistan. The first man lunged, his shiv aimed for Malik's chest, his voice a snarl of hatred. This is for thinking you're better than us. But Malik sidestepped, driving his own blade into the man's shoulder, the attacker howling as he stumbled back, blood trickling down his arm. His racist taunt silenced by the reality of Malik's strength, a strength that defied their hatred, that defied their racism, that defied their attempts to break him. Carlos and the strikers moved in, their weapons flashing, their voices a low growl of defiance as they fought beside Malik. Their shared struggle, a bond that carried them through the chaos, a bond forged in the crucible of a system that had always targeted them, that had always seen them as less, as threats to be eliminated. Malik's shiv slashed through the air, his fists flying, every strike calculated, every movement designed to conserve energy. A solid punch to one attacker's jaw, sending him sprawling. But another came at him from the side, a blade slicing dangerously close to his arm, the sting sharp but familiar. A pain he pushed through as he drove his shoulder into the man, sending him crashing to the floor. His racist jeer, "You don't belong here, boy," cut off by the impact. The fight was chaos, a whirlwind of blades and fists, the strikers holding their own, but the Iron Fangs' numbers pressing them back, their hatred a relentless tide, their voices a chorus of racism that echoed through the corridor, a chorus Malik refused to let drown him, his resolve a fire that burned brighter with every strike, a fire that refused to be extinguished by their prejudice. Drake watched from the edge of the fray, his smirk fading as he saw his men fall, his voice a snarl of frustration as he stepped forward, his eyes burning with hatred, his tone dripping with venom. "You're nothing. Stone," he roared, his voice a declaration of racism as much as of violence. "Just another black thug who doesn't know his place. I'll put you down myself." Drake lunged, his fist coming fast and hard, catching Malik in the ribs, the pain searing through him as he staggered, his vision blurring for a moment. But Malik didn't falter. He swung his shiv, the blade slicing across Drake's arm, Drake howling as he stumbled back, clutching the wound, his hatred for Malik's skin fueling his next attack, his voice a snarl of rage. "You'll pay for that, boy!" Malik didn't respond, his breathing heavy, his body aching, but his resolve unshaken. He lunged forward, tackling Drake to the ground, his shiv pressed to Drake's throat, his voice a low growl of defiance, his eyes burning with a fire that refused to be extinguished by their hatred. "Who hired you?" "Drake," he demanded, his tone steady, his gaze unyielding. "Who paid you to kill me? Tell me now, or I'll make sure you don't walk away from this." Drake's eyes widened, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Malik's strength, his voice trembling as he spat out the truth, his hatred for Malik's skin a raw wound, a wound that had been exposed by the reality of Malik's defiance. A black man who refused to break, who refused to bow. "It was Vincent Kane," he said, his voice a mix of fear and rage, his words a confession as much as a curse. "Big shot businessman, wanted you out of the way, said you were a problem, that you knew too much about some deal he was trying to close, said we get a bonus if we finished you off." Malik's jaw tightened, the name a thunderclap in his mind, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Vincent Kane, a man who'd used his wealth and power to frame him, to hire the Iron Fangs, to silence him before he could uncover the truth, a truth that had been buried by a system that had always targeted black men like him, that had always seen them as threats to be eliminated. And the evidence? Malik pressed, his shiv digging into Drake's throat, his voice a low growl of determination. Did Cain plant it to frame me? Drake nodded frantically, his voice trembling, his hatred for Malik's skin a raw wound, a wound that had been exposed by the reality of Malik's strength. Yeah, he said he had connections, people in the system who owed him favors. That's how he got you thrown in here. Malik exhaled slowly, his grip loosening slightly. The truth a lifeline in a place that thrived on lies. A truth that would set him free. A truth that would bring down the man who'd targeted him. A man who'd used racism and corruption to silence him. A man who'd underestimated the strength of a black man who refused to break, who refused to bow. He stepped back, letting Drake slump to the ground, his face pale and bloodied, his crew scattered around him, their racist taunts silenced by the reality of their defeat, a defeat at the hands of a man they'd seen as less, as a target to be broken, a man who'd proven them wrong with every strike, every step, every breath. Malik stood tall, his chest heaving, his body aching, but his resolve a fire that burned brighter than ever, a fire that refused to be extinguished by their hatred, a fire that would carry him through the fight to come, a fight for justice, a fight for the truth, a fight that would change everything. The morning light filtered in through the narrow, grimy window of Malik Stone's cell in the Santa Monica prison, casting faint rays across the cracked concrete floor, a stark contrast to the cold, gray walls that had confined him for months, walls that had borne witness to his fight for survival, to the racist taunts of the Iron Fangs. You don't belong here, boy. Or to the violence that had sought to break him, not just as a man, but as a black man, his skin a target in a system that had always seen him as less, as a threat to be eliminated. Malik sat on the edge of his cot, his dark skin still bruised from the fight in the laundry room, his braided hair pulled tight, his dark brown eyes reflecting a quiet resolve, a fire that had carried him through war zones as a Delta Force commander, a fire that had burned brighter in the face of the hatred and corruption that had landed him here, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the prejudice that had followed him his whole life. The clang of keys snapped him out of his thoughts, a guard appearing at the bars, clipboard in hand, his expression one of mild disinterest, his voice gruff but lacking the disdain Malik had come to expect, a small mercy in a place that had offered so little. "Stone, time to go," the guard said, his tone flat, his gaze flickering to the paperwork in his hand, a paperwork that held the truth Malik had fought for, a truth that would set him free, a truth that had been buried by a system that had targeted him for his skin as much as for his defiance. Malik exhaled deeply, rising from the cot with deliberate slowness, every movement a reminder of the brutal battles he'd survived, the pain a testament to his strength, a strength that had defied the Iron Fangs' racism, that had defied the corruption of Vincent Cain, a man who'd used his wealth and power to frame him, to hire a gang to kill him, to silence him before he could uncover the truth. As he stepped out of the cell, he glanced down the hallway, his eyes locking onto Drake Voss, slumped against the bars of his own cell, his face swollen and his lips split from the beating Malik had given him, his gaze burning with hatred, a hatred rooted in racism as much as in defeat, a hatred that had seen Malik as less, as a target to be broken, a hatred that had been proven wrong by Malik's defiance, by his survival, by his victory. "This ain't over, Stone," Drake rasped, his voice hoarse, his tone a mix of rage and humiliation, his eyes burning with the same prejudice that had fueled his attacks, a prejudice that had seen Malik's skin as a justification for violence, a prejudice Malik had faced his whole life, a prejudice he'd never let break him. Malik's lips curled into a faint smirk, his tone steady and cold, his gaze unyielding, a testament to the warrior he'd always been, a warrior who'd never backed down, who'd never let hatred define him. "You keep saying that, Drake," he said, his voice low but firm. "But here I am, walking out, while you're stuck in this cage. Looks like I'm the one who won." Drake slammed his hand against the bars, but Malik didn't look back, the sound fading behind him as he followed the guard down the corridor, each step bringing him closer to freedom. A freedom he'd fought for with every strike, every breath. A freedom that had been stolen from him by a system that had always targeted black men like him. A system he was determined to fight, to change, to ensure no one else faced the same injustice. The processing room was stark and clinical, its walls painted a lifeless gray, the air heavy with the scent of bureaucracy and despair. A fitting end to a nightmare that had begun with a frame job. A nightmare fueled by racism as much as by corruption. A nightmare Malik had survived through sheer will, through the strength of a black man who refused to break, who refused to bow. He stood silently as the clerk went through the usual motions, handing over his personal belongings, a watch, a wallet, and the dog tags he hadn't seen since the day he'd been incarcerated. The cool metal pressing against his skin like a lifeline, a reminder of who he was, who he still had to be. A Delta Force commander who'd earned the name The Shadow, a man who'd fought for his country, a man who'd been betrayed by it, a man who'd never stopped fighting for justice, for himself, for his people. The clerk droned on, explaining the release process, but Malik barely listened, his mind already on what came next. He had a name now, Vincent Kane, and a purpose that had been forged in the crucible of the prison, a purpose that had been fueled by every sir, every attack, every moment of injustice he'd faced as a black man in a system that had always sought to break him. As the final papers were signed, Ava Bennett walked into the room, her heels clicking softly against the floor, her sharp hazel eyes immediately landing on Malik, a faint smile tugging at her lips, her presence a beacon of hope in a place that had offered so little, a beacon of justice in a system that had offered so much injustice. "Malik," she said, her voice a mix of relief and determination, her gaze softening as she took in the bruises on his face. The toll of a fight that had been as much about racism as it had been about survival. A fight she'd helped him win. A fight that had brought them here, to this moment of freedom. A moment that had been stolen from him by a system that had always targeted black men like him. A system they'd fought together to defy. Malik turned, his face softening ever so slightly, his voice low but warm, a testament to the bond they'd forged. A bond that had carried him through the darkest moments. A bond that had given him hope when all seemed lost. He said, his tone steady, his eyes burning with a fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that had sought to break him. "Thanks for everything. I wouldn't be here without you." Ava's smile grew, but there was a seriousness in her eyes, a recognition of the fight that lay ahead, a fight that went beyond Malik, that went to the heart of a system that had always targeted black men like him, that had always seen them as threats to be eliminated. "You're out now, Malik," she said, her voice steady. "But this fight isn't over. Vincent Kane's still out there." Malik's jaw tightened at the name. The man who'd orchestrated his downfall. The man who'd used his wealth and power to frame him, to hire the Iron Fangs, to silence him before he could uncover the truth. A truth that had been buried by a system that had always targeted black men like him. A system he was determined to fight, to change, to ensure no one else faced the same injustice. "I know," he said, his voice low but firm, his gaze steady, his resolve a fire that burned brighter than ever. "He's the reason I'm in this mess, and he's the reason I can't just walk away, but now I have a chance to do something about it." Ava hesitated, her voice dropping slightly, her concern evident, a concern born of the bond they'd forged. A bond that had carried them through the darkest moments. A bond that had given them both hope when all seemed lost. "You don't have to do this alone, you know," she said, her tone soft but firm. "I've already started digging into Kane's background. He's careful, but no one's untouchable." Malik studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, his mind racing with the possibilities, the challenges, the fight that lay ahead, a fight that went beyond him, that went to the heart of a system that had always targeted black men like him, that had always seen them as threats to be eliminated. Finally, he nodded, his voice steady, his resolve a fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that had sought to break him. "Good," he said, his tone low but firm, "because I'm not stopping until I bring him down." The guard signaled that it was time to leave, and Ava stepped aside, letting Malik walk toward the door, his steps steady, his gaze fixed ahead, the bright sunlight hitting him like a wave as he crossed the threshold, warm and blinding after months of fluorescent glare and shadowy corridors. A freedom he'd fought for with every strike, every breath. A freedom that had been stolen from him by a system that had always targeted black men like him. A system he was determined to fight, to change, to ensure no one else faced the same injustice. The car ride was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound as Ava drove them away from the prison. Malik staring out the window, watching the landscape pass by in a blur of green and gray. His body still sore, but his mind sharp, focused on what came next, on the man who'd orchestrated his downfall, on the system that had enabled it, a system that had always targeted black men like him, that had always seen them as threats to be eliminated. "You've got somewhere to stay?" Ava asked, breaking the silence, her voice soft but firm, her concern evident, a concern born of the bond they'd forged, a bond that had carried them through the darkest moments, a bond that had given them both hope when all seemed lost. Malik nodded, his voice low but steady, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his mind racing with the possibilities, the challenges, the fight that lay ahead, a fight that went beyond him, that went to the heart of a system that had always targeted black men like him, that had always seen them as threats to be eliminated. "I'll figure it out," he said, his tone unwavering, his resolve a fire that burned brighter than ever. "First, I need to regroup, get my head on straight, and then Kane." Ava pressed gently, her voice soft but firm, her grip tightening on the steering wheel, her concern evident, a concern born of the bond they'd forged, a bond that had carried them through the darkest moments, a bond that had given them both hope when all seemed lost. "Just promise me you'll be careful, whoever Kane is. He has resources. He managed to frame you. Hire a gang to kill you in prison, and keep his hands clean. He's not someone to underestimate." Malik's lips twitched into a faint smile, his gaze steady, his resolve a fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that had sought to break him. A fire that had been stoked by every slur, every attack, every moment of injustice he'd faced as a black man in a system that had always sought to break him. "I don't underestimate anyone," he said, his voice low but firm. "But Kane made one mistake. He didn't finish the job. Now it's my turn." Ava didn't respond, but the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. A promise of justice, a promise of defiance, a promise that the fight was far from over, a fight that went beyond Malik, that went to the heart of a system that had always targeted black men like him, that had always seen them as threats to be eliminated, a fight he was determined to win, for himself, for his people, for every black man who'd been judged, dismissed, targeted by a system that had never given them a fair chance. The Los Angeles skyline glimmered in the night, its towering buildings casting long shadows over the streets below, a city of light and shadow that mirrored the journey Malik Stone had endured, a journey that had taken him from the cold, gray walls of the Santa Monica prison to this moment, a moment of reckoning, a moment of justice, a moment that would change everything. Months had passed since his release, since the revelation of Vincent Kane's role in framing him, in hiring the Iron Fangs to kill him, in using his wealth and power to silence a black man who dared to stand in his way, a man who dared to fight for justice in a system that had always targeted people like him, that had always seen them as threats to be eliminated. Malik sat in a darkened apartment, the faint glow of a burner phone screen illuminating his face, his dark skin still bearing the scars of his time in prison, his braided hair pulled tight, his dark brown eyes sharp and focused, his resolve a fire that had burned brighter with every step, a fire that had carried him through war zones as a Delta Force commander, a fire that had refused to be extinguished by the racism and corruption that had sought to break him, a fire that had been stoked by every slur, every attack, every moment of injustice he'd faced as a black man in a system that had never given him a fair chance. Ava Bennett had sent him the final details. Vincent Kane was hosting a high-stakes meeting in one of his office buildings downtown. A last-ditch effort to secure his position, to lock down his network of bribes and deals before Malik could bring it all crashing down. A meeting Malik knew he had to infiltrate if he was going to end this, if he was going to bring justice to a man who'd used racism and corruption to silence him. A man who'd underestimated the strength of a black man who refused to break, who refused to bow. Malik set the phone down, his mind racing. This wasn't just another step. It was the moment, the culmination of a fight that had consumed him for months, a fight that went beyond him, that went to the heart of a system that had always targeted black men like him, that had always seen them as threats to be eliminated, a fight he was determined to win for himself, for his people, for every black man who'd been judged, dismissed, targeted by a system that had never given them a fair chance. The office tower loomed above him, its sleek glass exterior reflecting the city lights, a symbol of Vincent Kane's power and corruption, a symbol Malik was determined to tear down, to expose for the rot it concealed, a rot that had targeted him as much for his skin as for his defiance, a rot that had sought to silence him before he could uncover the truth. He parked his car a block away, moving quietly through the darkness, his steps silent, his movements calculated, his training as the shadow kicking in, a training that had kept him alive in war zones, a training that would carry him through this final battle, a battle for justice, a battle for the truth, a battle that would change everything. The service entrance on the east side was lightly guarded, just as Ava had predicted. A single guard stationed outside, his posture relaxed, his attention distracted, a weakness Malik exploited with the precision of a Delta Force commander, moving swiftly to take the man down with a chokehold, easing him to the ground without a sound, his key card now in Malik's hand, a key to the heart of Kane's empire, a key to the justice he'd fought for. A justice that had been stolen from him by a system that had always targeted black men like him. A system he was determined to fight, to change, to ensure no one else faced the same injustice. The elevator doors slid open with a muted chime, revealing the opulent design of the top floor. Polished marble floors, modern art on the walls, a panoramic view of the city glowing in the night beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. A space that exuded wealth and power. But to Malik, it was all a facade, masking the corruption beneath. A corruption that had targeted him as much for his skin as for his defiance. A corruption he was determined to expose, to dismantle, to destroy. He stepped out cautiously, the keycard he'd swiped from the guard still in his hand, his sharp eyes scanning the hallway ahead. The silence unnerved, but a silence he knew better than to trust. Kane wouldn't leave this space unprotected. Not tonight. Not when he knew Malik was coming for him. A black man who dared to defy him, who dared to fight back, who dared to refuse to break, to refuse to bow. Two guards stood nearer the entrance to the conference room, their stances alert, their weapons visible beneath their jackets. Their presence a testament to Kane's paranoia, a paranoia born of the knowledge that Malik was coming for him, that a black man he'd underestimated was coming to bring him down. Malik crouched behind a decorative planter, taking a moment to observe their movements, his mind racing with the precision of a Delta Force commander, a commander who'd earned the name the Shadow in the deserts of Afghanistan, a commander who'd never backed down, who'd never let hatred define him, who'd never let injustice stand. A nearby emergency panel on the wall caught his eye. An idea forming, he moved silently, sticking to the shadows, prying it open with careful precision, finding the fire alarm control. A distraction that would pull the guards away. A distraction that would give him the opening he needed to strike, to bring justice to a man who'd used racism and corruption to silence him. A man who'd underestimated the strength of a black man who refused to break, who refused to bow. He pressed the button, a sharp beeping noise filling the air. The guards immediately tensing, their hands moving to their weapons as they exchanged glances. One barking, "Go check it out." The second guard moving toward the sound, leaving his companion alone at the doors. A weakness Malik seized with the precision of a warrior, closing the distance in seconds, striking with a sharp jab to the man's neck, followed by a quick sweep of his legs. The guard crumpling to the floor, stunned but conscious. Malik clamping a hand over his mouth, pressing the shiv to his throat, his voice cold and steady. "Don't make a sound. I'm not here for you." "Where's Kane?" The guard's eyes darted nervously to the double doors, his voice a whisper. "In there." His fear keeping him frozen as Malik pulled the guard's radio from his belt, smashing it against the floor, ensuring no alarms would be raised. His gaze hardening as he stood, his resolve a fire that burned brighter than ever, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that had sought to break him, a fire that would carry him through this final battle, a battle for justice, a battle for the truth, a battle that would change everything. Malik pushed the doors open just enough to slip inside. The conference room coming into view, a long mahogany table dominating the space, sleek monitors lining the walls. Vincent Kane sitting at the head, his suit impeccable, his expression calm, as if he were completely unaware of the intrusion. His arrogance a testament to the power he'd wielded, a power that had targeted Malik as much for his skin as for his defiance. A power Malik was determined to tear down, to expose, to destroy. Two guards flanked Kane, their hands flying to their weapons as Malik entered. But Malik's voice cut through the room like a knife, his shiv in one hand, the guard's pistol in the other, the barrel pointed directly at Kane, his tone sharp and commanding. "Don't, unless you want your boss to take the first hit." Kane's head lifted slowly, his gaze meeting Malik's with a calm, almost amused expression, his voice smooth and unbothered, a testament to the arrogance that had led him to underestimate Malik. A black man who dared to defy him, who dared to fight back, who dared to refuse to break, to refuse to bow. "Mr. Stone," he said, his tone laced with derision. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Malik stepped further into the room, his every movement calculated, his resolve a fire that burned brighter than ever, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that had sought to break him, a fire that would carry him through this final battle, a battle for justice, a battle for the truth, a battle that would change everything. "I've had enough of your games. Kane," he said, his voice low but firm, his gaze unyielding. "This ends tonight." And Kane leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips, his arrogance a testament to the power he'd wielded, a power that had targeted Malik as much for his skin as for his defiance, a power Malik was determined to tear down, to expose, to destroy. "Does it?" he said, his voice a mix of amusement and disdain. "Because from where I'm sitting, you look like a desperate man with nothing to lose." Malik's grip tightened on the pistol, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, his eyes burning with a fire that had carried him through war zones, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that had sought to break him, a fire that would carry him through this final battle, a battle for justice, a battle for the truth, a battle that would change everything. "You're right about one thing, I've got nothing to lose," he said, his tone steady, his gaze unyielding. "But you've got everything, and I'm about to take it all away." The guards hesitated, their hands hovering near their weapons as they glanced at Cain for direction. Their presence, a testament to Cain's paranoia. A paranoia born of the knowledge that Malik was coming for him. That a black man he'd underestimated was coming to bring him down. "Stand down," Cain said coolly, waving a hand. His arrogance a testament to the power he'd wielded. A power that had targeted Malik as much for his skin as for his defiance. A power Malik was determined to tear down, to expose, to destroy. Let's hear what Mr. Stone has to say. After all, he's gone through so much trouble to get here. Malik's eyes narrowed. His resolve a fire that burned brighter than ever. A fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that had sought to break him. A fire that would carry him through this final battle. A battle for justice. A battle for the truth. A battle that would change everything. "Start talking. Cain," he said, his voice sharp and commanding, his gaze unyielding. "Tell me everything, or I'll tear this whole operation apart piece by piece." Cain's smirk widened, his voice a mix of amusement and disdain, his arrogance a testament to the power he'd wielded, a power that had targeted Malik as much for his skin as for his defiance, a power Malik was determined to tear down, to expose, to destroy. "And what exactly do you think you are going to do about it?" he said, his tone laced with derision. "Even if what you're saying were true, who's going to believe you? You're an ex-con. No one cares what you think, especially not a black man who's been where you've been." The slur hit like a slap, a reminder of the racism that had fueled Cain's actions, a racism that had seen Malik's skin as a justification for silencing him, a racism that had followed him his whole life, a racism he refused to let break him. Malik leaned in, his face inches from Cain's, his voice a low growl of defiance, his eyes burning with a fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that had sought to break him, a fire that would carry him through this final battle, a battle for justice, a battle for the truth, a battle that would change everything. "You really want to test me," he said, his tone steady, his gaze unyielding. "Fine, let's talk about your operation, about the bribes tied to your accounts, about the evidence Nate Riley handed over, emails, payment logs, even photos of you meeting with gang leaders. You think you're untouchable, but I've got enough to put you away, and if you don't admit it now, I'll make sure every one of your associates knows you turned on them first." Cain's face paled, the weight of Malik's words sinking in, his hands curling into fists, his breathing uneven, his arrogance crumbling under the pressure. A pressure born of the knowledge that Malik had the truth, that a black man he'd underestimated had the power to bring him down, a power he'd never anticipated, a power he'd never respected, a power he'd never believed a black man could wield. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice a low growl, his arrogance giving way to desperation. "I did what I had to do. You were a threat to everything I've built." Malik's eyes narrowed, his voice sharp and commanding, his gaze unyielding, his resolve a fire that burned brighter than ever, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that had sought to break him, a fire that would carry him through this final battle, a battle for justice, a battle for the truth, a battle that would change everything. "So you admit it. You framed me. You planted the drugs, paid off everyone to make sure I went down for it?" Cain hesitated, but the pressure was too much, his voice rising, his words a confession as much as a curse, his arrogance giving way to the reality of his defeat, a defeat at the hands of a black man he'd underestimated, a black man who dared to defy him, who dared to fight back, who dared to refuse to break, to refuse to bow. "Yes, I did it. All right," he snapped, his voice a mix of rage and desperation. "You cost me millions with your damn advice to those people. I couldn't afford for you to get in my way again, so we made sure you were out of the picture." The room fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging heavy in the air, Malik's expression unchanged. But inside, he felt the first stirrings of vindication, a vindication that had been months in the making, a vindication that had been fueled by every slur, every attack, every moment of injustice he'd faced as a black man in a system that had always sought to break him. "And the Iron Fangs?" Malik pressed, his voice a low growl of determination, his gaze unyielding, his resolve a fire that burned brighter than ever, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that had sought to break him, a fire that would carry him through this final battle, a battle for justice, a battle for the truth, a battle that would change everything. "You paid them to kill me in prison?" Cain glared at him, his defiance flickering, his voice a mix of rage and resignation, his words a confession as much as a curse, his arrogance giving way to the reality of his defeat, a defeat at the hands of a black man he'd underestimated, a black man who dared to defy him, who dared to fight back, who dared to refuse to break, to refuse to bow. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice a snarl of frustration. "This isn't personal, it's business. You were a loose end, and I tied it up. Your skin just made it easier to justify." The double doors burst open, Ava Bennett entering, flanked by Detective Harris and a team of officers. Harris's voice firm as he held up a warrant, his presence a testament to the justice Malik had fought for, a justice that had been stolen from him by a system that had always targeted black men like him, a system he'd fought to change, to ensure no one else faced the same injustice. "Vincent Cain," Harris announced, his voice steady. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, attempted murder, and other charges. Everything you just said is on record, and we've got enough evidence to take down your entire operation." Cain shot to his feet, his voice panicked, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of his defeat. A defeat at the hands of a black man he'd underestimated, a black man who dared to defy him, who dared to fight back, who dared to refuse to break, to refuse to bow. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice a mix of rage and desperation. "I built this city. You don't know what you're doing." Malik stepped as Harris approached, his expression calm, his voice steady, his resolve a fire that burned brighter than ever, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that had sought to break him, a fire that had carried him through this final battle, a battle for justice, a battle for the truth, a battle that had changed everything. "No, Cain," he said, his tone low but firm. "You don't know what you've done, but you're about to find out." As Cain was cuffed and led away, his threats falling on deaf ears, Malik turned to Ava, the faintest hint of relief softening his features, his voice low but steady, a testament to the bond they had forged, a bond that had carried them through the darkest moments, a bond that had given them both hope when all seemed lost. "It's over," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his mind racing with the possibilities, the challenges, the fight that lay ahead, a fight that went beyond him, that went to the heart of a system that had always targeted black men like him, that had always seen them as threats to be eliminated. Ava nodded, her voice steady, her gaze softening as she looked at him, her presence a beacon of hope in a world that had offered so little, a beacon of justice in a system that had offered so much injustice. "For now," she said, her tone a mix of relief and determination. "But you've done it. Malik, you've cleared your name." Malik exhaled deeply, the tension finally easing from his shoulders, his resolve a fire that burned brighter than ever, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that had sought to break him, a fire that had carried him through this final battle, a battle for justice, a battle for the truth, a battle that had changed everything. "It's not just about me," he said, his voice low but firm, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his mind racing with the possibilities, the challenges, the fight that lay ahead, a fight that went beyond him, that went to the heart of a system that had always targeted black men like him, that had always seen them as threats to be eliminated. "It's about everyone Cain hurt, the people who lost their homes, who were threatened, silenced. They deserved justice too. And all the black men like me, locked up for nothing, judged before they can even speak. I'm going to keep fighting for them. Ava placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm, her voice steady, her presence a beacon of hope in a world that had offered so little, a beacon of justice in a system that had offered so much injustice. You'd be good at that. Malik, she said, her tone a mix of admiration and determination. You've seen the system from the inside. You know how broken it is. If anyone can change it, it's you. Malik nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his chest rising and falling with a deep, steady breath. His resolve a fire that burned brighter than ever, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the hatred that had sought to break him, a fire that had carried him through this final battle, a battle for justice, a battle for the truth, a battle that had changed everything. For the first time in years, he felt at peace, the scars of his ordeal a reminder of what he'd overcome, of the strength he'd found in himself, a strength that had defied racism, that had defied corruption, that had defied a system that had always sought to break him, a strength that would carry him forward into a new fight, a fight for justice, a fight for change, a fight for a world where no black man would have to face the same injustice he had, a world he was determined to build, one battle at a time. Leon, a Black Delta Force hero, fought a racist prison gang and won justice. Thanks for watching this powerful story. Smash that like button, share to inspire change, and subscribe with notifications on for our latest videos. Your support fights prejudice. Let's keep it going. See you in the next one.